Made for the South Pole. Book 7 in the Romance Island Resort series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Nothing brought a smile to Jean's face like penguins. There was just something about them that could make anyone happy. Here on Heard Island there were hundreds of them, waddling around Wharf Point without a care in the world. Triumph exploded in Jean's chest. He'd found them. Now all he needed to do was find a high vantage point, where he could see if there were any babies in the colony. A moss-covered mound looked to be the highest point on this part of the Azorella Peninsula, so Jean scrambled across the dark volcanic rock toward his own personal grassy knoll. Once he reached the top he'd see the cushion plant beneath his feet compressed under his weight. Sinkhole. One word was all Jean had time to think before the fragile net gave way. Falling into darkness. 1 second. 2. 3. Was it eternity, or did it just feel that way? The impact jarred every bone in his body, forcing the breath from his lungs. He lifted his head to watch the cloud of condensation whoosh upwards, a smoke signal to mark his location, but there was no sky to be seen above. The traitorous bush had covered its trap, Jean realized. Damn Australian territory, even if it was part of Antarctica and not the Aussie mainland. Even the plants were trying to kill him. But he was a goddamn Canadian biologist, and not city-bred either. He'd grown up next door to the Arctic, and he wasn't about to be outsmarted by a plant on the wrong side of the world. Jean extended his arms, reaching for a wall or a rock or something else to haul himself up on. He couldn't have fallen that far. A couple of meters, maybe. No more than 3. His fingers touched cool smooth stone. Ha! He must have lost his glove on the way down. Just one though, he still wore the other one. He ran his bare hand over the rock, looking for a ledge or bulge big enough to wrap his hand around to take his weight. He found a hole big enough to fit his whole hand inside, then another, and that was enough. Under his breath he muttered, 1 2 thr. The moment he put weight on his leg, pain knifed through him. Much like space, in a lava tube on Heard Island, no one could hear you scream. Breathing hard, Jean leaned on his other leg instead. This time he didn't get to scream. The pain was so bad, it stole all of his senses as it knocked him out. 2. Audra had never been so exhausted in her life, so naturally, she wanted to dance on the ceiling. She wasn't sure how many people had actually seen the South Pole, but now she was one of them. It felt exhilarating. Hence the need to dance as soon as she could shut the door of her tiny room, where no one would see. The buzzing in her blood was better than sex. Everyone had sex. Except her room wasn't hers. Well, it was, but it was someone else's too. The vacant bunk she'd considered her reading lounge was now occupied by a girl with a round, smiling face. Hi. Finally we meet. I'm Shelley. You must be Audra. The guys told me it's your first trip, and you've already seen the pole. 3 winters I've spent here, and my first expedition out there, I failed the medical, and you got to go instead. I'm sure there'll be others. Some of the equipment wasn't up to spec, so when the right stuff arrives next summer, a team will need to return. Audra couldn't keep the longing out of her tone. Of course she wanted to be part of it. Who wouldn't? But she was only covering Shelley's maternity leave, after all, and it looked like her time was up. How's your little girl anyway? Now it was Shelley's turn to look wistful. She said her first word the day before I left, Mum. It killed me to leave her, but Ross and I agreed that he'd get to be a stay-at-home dad with her while I went off to work. God, I hope he can handle it. She waved at their cramped room. This'll seem like a holiday in comparison though. They both laughed. Sorry, you probably want a minute to yourself after all that time in the field. Video calls home and such. I'll go take a shower before the boys use all the water. Shelley grabbed her towel and slung it over her shoulder. Watch out for the shower monitor. He's a big Russian bloke named Boris. If you try to take a shower even a second longer than 3 minutes, he'll bust in and carry you off for torture and whatever else Russians do to traitors. Apparently. Shelley's face fell. You mean Bruce left? He's the best plumber on the continent. Audra couldn't hide her smile. No, but he did spend a whole day booming at me in a thick Russian accent until one of the other guys ratted him out. I've never forgotten to time my showers since. Shelley laughed and headed for the showers. Alone, Audra decided dancing was probably a bad idea, so she dusted off her laptop and woke it up. Calling home could wait until tomorrow, but she could catch up on news and email in the meantime. Hundreds of unread emails awaited her, so she sighed and sat down to sort the spam from the 63 emails from Jay. More? She hadn't heard a peep from him since she left Romance Island, and she never expected to either. Well, okay, for the first week she'd kind of hoped, and maybe for the second one too, especially after she'd sent him the photo of them together, and the third week. But by the time she'd boarded the Aurora Australis, she'd barely checked her email at all. And not because of the restricted internet access either. So why on earth was he sending her thrice daily emails? Curiosity won, and she opened the most recent one. Why won't you answer my messages? Another. We were made for each other. Where are you? That popped up a lot, though the wording varied a bit, depending on the day. After the first couple dozen, Audra skimmed to the first one he'd sent. I'm home. Where are you, baby? Why aren't you here? Had he completely forgotten about her new job? The reason she was leaving the island? Maybe he was drunk. It still didn't explain why he thought she should be at the resort. Exasperated, Audra typed a response. I'm at Davis as one of the Antarctic meteorology team this summer. I just got back from an expedition to Dome Argus and the South Pole. It was awesome, thanks for asking. She hit send and scrolled through her emails, looking for anything from her family and friends. Her laptop chimed, signaling that someone wanted to start a video call. Jay, who else? She hadn't had a shower in days, and her hair had been mashed under an assortment of hats and hoods for weeks. One look at her would scare him off for life. Reluctantly, she allowed the call to connect. Where the fuck are you really? Jay Felix was all charm. Audra took a deep breath. She'd thought the soundproofing at the resort was bad. Here at Davis, if she raised her voice, the whole building would hear. Hi Jay. It's lovely to see you again. It's been months, I'm sure, though I gather you've been busy with your band's tour. I've been very busy too. First training for my first Antarctic expedition, and then living and working out here for the summer. There are real penguins here, not just a jetty named after one. I must say, the jetty smells better though. Why aren't you here? Judging by his slurred voice, sobriety had deserted him several hours ago. I don't work at Romance Island Resort anymore, remember? No. Was it because of me? Did you quit because of me? I told you I was coming back, babe. I own the hotel. Had to come back. He hadn't known? Then what had he meant that night when they'd... That last night we spent together. When you answered the door, you said I was just in time and I'd left it until the last minute. You knew it was my last day and I was flying out to Hobart on Monday. No, I fucking didn't. You never told me that. Audra mulled this over. So let me get this straight. You spent the night with me, made all sorts of promises you had no intention of keeping, then flew out the next morning to record your new album and go on tour. All the while, not saying a single thing to me. Not a word, a phone call, an email, nothing, until now, when you're demanding to know why I'm not waiting for you with open arms after you deserted me. I didn't desert you. I had to work. And who doesn't? When I got offered the chance of a lifetime, a stint in Antarctica, I took it. I'd have been crazy not to. Especially after dealing with VIPs who threw tantrums, painted the walls with ketchup, and slept with anything in a skirt. She'd never get the image of Jay and Penny out of her mind. It would scar her for life. Ooh, is that your boyfriend? Hi, I'm Shelley, Audra's roommate. Shelley smiled and waved over Audra's shoulder before throwing herself on her bed. Don't mind me. Yes, I'm Audra's, Jay began. Audra cut in, no, he's not my boyfriend. Never was, never will be. He used to be my boss. Though it was on the tip of her tongue, she didn't add that he'd once been the bane of her existence. It didn't seem fair to kick a man when he was down. What about all the time we spent together? Jay exploded. Are you honestly saying everything, the time, the incredible sex, meant nothing to you? Audra heard Shelley laugh softly, then whisper an apology. It was one night, Jay. One night that you made astonishingly clear meant nothing to you, when you climbed into a helicopter the morning after, then ignored me for months while wrapping yourself in different girls every night. Do you even remember how many? I mean, you did 20-30 shows at least, and I know for a fact that you took half a dozen girls back to your hotel room after the Perth concert. Add that all up and I don't need to be a statistician to know you've probably slept with over 100 women, while you didn't even have time to send me an email saying hi. She drew in a deep, shaky breath. If it weren't for the other girls, maybe I'd be interested if we were to meet again. But right now, if you showed up in the snow outside my door, I'd kick you right back to the boat that brought your sorry ass to Antarctica. His eyes got that kicked puppy look that a dog gets when. Audra had never kicked a puppy, but she figured hurt and betrayal and big, wide eyes would feature in there somewhere. But I could fly there now. We can talk about this. I could take you home and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. How about it? A fresh start with just you and me. I'll marry you if that's what you want. No other women ever again. I swear. That same beseeching look she'd surrendered to before. Never again. Jay, you barely know me. Normal people don't marry strangers. Especially not strangers who've slept with 100 other people in less than 6 months. Please, baby, give me time to book a flight and... Audra's heart nearly broke at the pain in his voice, but somehow she mentally sticky-taped it back together and said, no. I ship out in a couple of days. Even if you did fly here, I'd be gone, on my way back to Melbourne to finish my training. I told you before, if you want a girl to love you, you have to be more than a rock star. Go back to the hotel library and do some more research. You'll see what happens to guys who cheat. They don't get the girl, that's for sure. She sighed. I'm sure she's out there, Jay, the right girl for you. But I'm not her. So good night, and good luck. Before he could say anything, she ended the call and slammed her laptop closed. Shelley whispered, was that really Jay Felix? Audra nodded. And you used to work for him? Another nod. Shelley cleared her throat. He's always had a reputation for, well, you know. But I've always wondered if it was true or just something the girls made up. What's he like in bed? In alarm, she added, I'm only asking in the name of scientific inquiry, of course. Happily married and stored in this fridge and all. Audra smiled faintly. Unbelievable. Shelley inhaled sharply. I knew it. Wait, in a good way or a bad way? Both. They both laughed, but Audra's heart wasn't in it anymore. Shelley was sensitive enough to stop. He seems really into you despite all his obvious failings. Is there any chance you and him might, reconnect? In some way? Audra shook her head. If he grew up a bit, and maybe turned into a good man instead of a spoiled, selfish asshole, maybe. But I think hell will freeze over first. She glanced out the window and noticed snow flurrying past the glass, dancing in an evening breeze that she'd never grow tired of watching. Unseen by anyone, her tears for Jay dropped onto the windowsill. 1, 2, 3, 4. The beats of a song that only her heart knew. Audra. The deep voice belonged to Bruce. I need your help. Audra wiped her eyes. It was silly to cry over a rock star. Especially if someone needed her. You need to pack your things. The Aurora Australis is here early. There was an emergency at Heard Island, so they detoured to pick up a man who was injured. The doctor's on standby at Casey, but they want someone with medical training to travel with him. Seeing as you're shipping out anyway, you just got volunteered. No time for tears. Audra had a job to do. 3. Freezing water lapping at his legs dragged Jean out of the darkness. He was already waist-deep, and it was rising. Darkness didn't help him work out where he was, until he remembered the cushion plant trying to kill him. He reached under the surface, feeling far enough down his legs to determine that they were both broken. Bits bent in ways that they shouldn't be capable of being bent. Up was out then, if he couldn't use his legs to climb to the top of the sinkhole. That meant he'd have to follow the lava tube to wherever it went. Wherever the water had come in. Quickly too, because he already couldn't feel his legs. That's because of the water temperature, he told himself, willing his mind away from what else that could mean. More bones broken than just his legs. If his back was broken and he couldn't walk again, there were other bits of his anatomy that wouldn't work either. Darren. She'd never forgive him if he came back, and it was his fault they couldn't have kids. He'd promised to give her children. If he didn't make it home safely, she'd kill him. No. He'd never broken a promise to her yet, and this wouldn't be the first. Jean fought to keep his breathing steady. No panicking. He had to get home to Darren, which meant getting out of this hole. The camp wasn't far. He'd seen the penguins from the shore, damn it, on the far side of Atlas Cove. All he had to do was get to where the geologists could see him from camp. He was wearing a standard issue fire engine red jacket, for fuck's sake. They couldn't miss him. Now to get out of this hole. Jean closed his eyes, trying to trace the sound of the waves. He rolled over onto his belly, propping himself up with his arms so his head was above water. Like a seal. He snorted. He wished there was a seal in the cave with him, to show him the way out. Without a seal, he did the best he could, angling his body so the wavelets broke against his chest. Fuck, but it was freezing. The sooner he was out of the water, the better. Jean dragged himself along the cave floor, first one arm, then the other in endless repetition until the ground dropped away and a wave broke over his head. He surfaced, spluttering, wishing he'd thought to bring a radio with him. He could have called for help, and told the rest of the team he'd run into trouble a few minutes' walk from camp. Sure, he'd be a laughing stock for the rest of the expedition, but he'd be a warm laughing stock. Another wave topped him, and Jean went under. This time, he didn't surface straight away, because he thought he saw light ahead. He squinted, trying to focus, to no avail. It was a light of some kind, all right, but the rock in front of him told him he'd have to swim underwater to reach it. He'd need a decent lungful of air for that. Jean lifted his head above the water, paddling with his hands to stay up. I'm coming, Darren, he swore, gulping a huge breath before he dived. He tried to kick with his legs, but the damn things wouldn't work. He breaststroked like a man possessed, pushing the water behind him as he paddled toward the light. Jean's lungs burned, but he swam on. He angled upward, praying he'd reach the surface soon. He could see his hands in front of him now, surely he'd cleared the cave. Was he out, or just in a larger cavern? Wind froze the water in his hair as Jean's head emerged from the sea. He sucked in a desperate breath, then another, as he took stock of his surroundings. Oh fuck. He'd surfaced in the cove, 20 meters from the far shore. He had more swimming to do. His arms were all he had, so no way in hell was he doing an Australian crawl. The near-freezing water was warmer than the air temperature. Gritting his teeth, Jean set a course directly across the cove toward camp. He tried not to think of leopard seals and orcas and anything else that lived in these waters. For the first time, he cursed being a biologist who knew this shit. At least there weren't any sharks, unless global warming had finally tempted them south. That would be the ultimate insult for a climate change biologist, to be eaten by something migrating with the warmer temperatures. Not today, Jean swore. I'm coming, Darren. I'm coming home. His arms ached, more and more leaden with every stroke, until his hand bumped against something harder than water. Please don't let it be an orca, he prayed, glancing down. A wave carried him further up the shore until his whole body rested on rock. Sharp chunks of volcanic rock, but right now it was the most beautiful beach he'd seen this week. He barely felt it through the numbing cold. Jean lifted his head. The camp was just ahead. All the buildings, where someone should be preparing dinner while everyone else relaxed after a hard day in the field. The buildings were there, sure, but no one was in sight. Maybe they were all inside, he reasoned. A team meeting or something. Someone would be out soon. They'd see him and carry him to one of the huts, so they could help him. He counted to 500 as he waited, but there was no movement at all. Had they decided to sleep aboard the research vessel instead then? Jean groaned as he stiffly rolled onto his back, propping himself up on his elbows to peer out into the cove for the ship. Which wasn't there. Fuck. While he'd been unconscious in his hole, the geologists had taken the ship out for a survey. It might be weeks before they returned. By that time the leopard seals would have eaten his remains. Not going to happen, he grunted, flipping onto his belly. He'd crawl back to camp if he had to, and radio those single-minded scientists to come back and get him. Fixing his gaze on the nearest hut, the decades-old, round red emergency shelter that they dubbed the Apple, Jean stretched his arm out to pull him a foot closer to the forbidden fruit. 2 broken legs were a fucking emergency. One arm pull, then the other pull, reach for another handhold, pull, don't stop, reach. I'm coming, Darren. I'm coming, he repeated. His wife's name was his mantra. He had to survive for her. His fingers scrabbled at the blood-colored hut. He nearly cried. All he had to do was reach the handle 3 feet above his head, and pull open the door. Eternities passed as Jean dragged his exhausted body to the side, his arm muscles screaming as he reached up and up until his fingers closed on the handle. When the door swung open, he felt a tear trickle from his eye before it froze on his cheek. Fucking Antarctica. If it weren't for the penguins, he wouldn't be here. Jean crawled inside the hut, then hooked his fingers through the vent at the bottom of the door to pull it shut behind him. Out of the wind, but not out of the woods. He struggled out of his coat and all the layers under it, until he peeled his soaked thermal shirt from his chest. He was bare for only a moment before he grabbed a musty blanket from the bunk and wrapped it around himself. He turned a second blanket into a cape across his shoulders, hoping to keep in what precious little remained of his body heat. His sodden pants would be another story, he knew. Once feeling returned to his legs, the agony that he'd felt before would return in full force, and he might pass out again. He had to radio for help first. Jean dragged the survival kit onto the floor and pried off the lid. He had to rummage through the box until he found the radio, before rummaging some more for some batteries. His hands shook as he shoved the batteries into the back of the radio. He knew shivering was better than his body not reacting to the cold at all, but it still made it hard to call for help. Finally, he managed to close the little plastic cover. Offering a silent prayer to anyone who was listening that the batteries weren't dead, Jean flicked the switch. Blessed static washed over him. The best sound in the world. Jean pressed the talk button. This is Jean Pennant on Heard Island. I have a medical emergency and require immediate assistance from anyone who can hear me. Repeat, need medevac from Heard Island. If you can hear me. He repeated the message and waited. He eased off his supposedly waterproof pants. Oh fuck. It looked like he had 5 knees. Definitely not natural. He wasn't sure if he wanted to peel off the thermals he wore underneath. He couldn't see any blood, which was a blessing, but there still could be internal bleeding. He had to. Oh fuck, that hurt. No response from the radio. He switched to another channel and tried again. This is Jean-Pierre Pennant on Heard Island, requesting immediate assistance. More static. Next channel. Hello, this is Jean-Pierre Pennant. Another channel. This is an SOS to anyone who can hear me. This is Jean-Pierre Pennant at Heard Island. The static crackled and beeped. You're late for your 12-hourly check-in, Pennant. Oh, thank fuck. Yeah, about that. I fell down a hole. I may have broken a few bones. You're in luck. We're still at Spit Bay. Dismantling the huts took longer than we expected. There's a couple of elephant seals who aren't helping. Could have done with your help charming them. Jean coughed out a laugh. It was a Weddell seal that fancied me, dude. A baby one. It was cute and it was curious and it liked the taste of my boots. The sort of thing you want to cuddle. Not an elephant seal. You're the biologist. Are you sure you're injured if you're laughing and trying to teach? Feeling was returning to Jean's legs now he was out of the cold and it fucking hurt. I've got 2 broken legs, man. It's bad. Jean heard swaying before it was replaced by static. He waited a few seconds before he ventured, You still there? The crackling ceased. Yeah. We'll be there as soon as we can. Where are you? The emergency apple. The one we're not supposed to use. More static before the voice came back. Pennant? One of the guys here said there should be a first aid kit in there. The supplies might be a bit out of date, but it should be fully stocked. He said he saw some of the really good meds in there. Stuff we're not allowed to carry now, but were fine back when the camp was constructed. Should be unopened. Can you check? He says it's under one of the bunks. Jean felt around in the cavity under the nearest bed, and was rewarded by the feel of a metal box. Yeah, got it. He flipped it open and took stock of the supplies. Enough gauze to wrap a mummy with enough alcohol wipes to embalm one. And under that. Jean gave a low whistle. Shit. Morphine. Captain thinks we'll be underway in a couple of hours. Can you wait that long, Pennant? Jean peeled open a syringe and plunged the needle into the morphine bottle, carefully drawing out a dose that matched the instructions. He swabbed his arm and took a deep breath. Just a scratch, he told himself. Fuck, he hated needles. But this one would be worth it. He gritted his teeth as he depressed the plunger, unleashing icy oblivion into his veins. Pennant? Yeah, man. I found the meds. Good shit, man. Good shit. Jean gritted his teeth and shucked off the rest of his clothes. Oh, his legs were seriously fucked up. He tucked a couple more blankets around himself, hiding his legs from sight. But they didn't hurt anymore, and that's what mattered. No. What mattered was Darien. Getting home to Darien. Jean lay down, drifting off on a morphine cloud. No wonder they locked this shit up.